So turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 11, and that's where we will be landing this morning for our sermon and for our lesson for this morning. Now, some of you might be wondering why we're in a series on discipleship, right? Why are we landing in Genesis chapter 11? And as we have been talking about the last several weeks, is that when you come to faith in Christ as a believer, you recognize fairly rapidly that you need to grow in your faith walk, and part of that growth in your faith walk is to understand some fundamental concepts as to what it means to be a disciple. And as we've been launching into this whole area of spiritual warfare and the difficulty that Christians have and believers have with respect to the whole battle that we face with respect to Satan, I thought it was important that we cover these first 5 divine institutions that God designed, so that we're fully aware as to where the true battleground lies with respect to Satan, not only in time past, but even now in our present time. Today, we're talking about the whole issue of Satan's objectives for the nations, and that is the whole issue of globalism. And we will be talking about that this morning. But as we look at this, we have a little bit of background and some information. And so the fall of man, it brought untold implications on what was once a perfect creation and order. And it's important for all Christians and for all disciples to understand the distinction between the creator and the creature. And if we don't understand and have a firm grasp of that reality, then you will never have a proper understanding of the magnificence and glory of God. He is not our buddy or our pal or our chum. He is the holy creator that is far different than anything that we have capacity to grasp or understand. But in the midst of all of that, in creation, man did fall, and the entire universe fell with man. And God created man to be a God's steward of what he's entrusted to us. And we talked a lot about that whole issue of creation and so forth. And then God provides man with a set of divine institutions, which we talked about. And today is the last one of those institutions, so that man would flourish and with God's creation. And he established order over creation. And all of these institutions are here and designed to honor God. And so we need to remember that these divine institutions that God created are, in fact, battlegrounds today in our world. And Satan is busy working to contra what God has designed and called into place. But nevertheless, the divine institutions are the law or practice that is absolute for all people, right? In all societies and all times, that provide freedom and security. And that's something that we need to remember about that. And so we've been on this journey over the last several weeks about the whole issue. The first one was the whole issue of work, being industrious. And that really is, when you look at it, it is the groundwork for economic systems and labor and the importance of labor. And that's the foundational truth that God instituted at the very beginning. And then the next one is marriage, and we talked about that as well. And then family. We did family last week, but nevertheless, in the week prior to that, when we celebrated our 250th anniversary, we talked about the whole institution of civil government and human government, and how God instituted the human government, how God instituted the family, and how each one of these are building blocks for a culture and for a society to flourish. And God has given us a kind of a handbook on how those things are to be done, and it was first started in the book of Genesis. And so now we come to this whole issue of the nations and people and peoples and languages, and how this divine institution came into being. But last week, or 2 weeks ago, we talked because these are building blocks, and each one of these building blocks, if you distort the very first one, it's going to have implications on the next one. So if you have for instance, my son and I were talking about this past week, and that is, if you have a marriage that has falters in it and cracks and so forth, it's going to have significant ramifications for the family. And if your marriage is not really based well and structured well through faith and so forth, it will have implications for the family. And if the family, right, has falters, it's going to have implications, right, for the next one. And so these are building blocks ideas, but nevertheless, 2 weeks ago, we were on this whole issue of civil government. So the issue here is that a civil government is a means of governance to promote the good and to punish evil. That's the primary purposes of civil government. Government leaders are seen as ministers of God. Well, wouldn't it be refreshing if people who are elected officials would see themselves as God's agents and that they are held accountable to God for what they do in office? But nevertheless, they are ministers of God, and they are to lead in those laws and justice as God's agent. And government leaders are accountable to God for their rule and their administration. And I don't believe that most of our elected officials today have any concept of the fact that they are held accountable to God for what they do. And so Christians, we are to submit to civil authorities so that they would seek God and rule righteously. And then we need to remember that civil obedience, there are situations where it is permissible to display civil disobedience, but that is rare, and we need to count the cost before doing so. So that brings us to this next issue, and we talk about all of these divine institutions, and that is Satan, what Satan seeks to accomplish in the midst of these divine institutions. And Satan's objectives is to, remember this is really important, that whatever God creates, okay, no matter what it is, whatever God creates, Satan seeks to deceive, to discount, to distort, divide, and destroy. We need to remember that Satan is the arch enemy of God. He is already defeated. But in the midst of all of that, he is doing everything he can to populate hell and depopulate heaven. And our job is to depopulate hell, right? And populate heaven. God came to redeem people. And so we saw here with this graphic that I have, I don't know if it comes out very good up there, but nevertheless, this is Satan's device of teaching the demons that I came up with in terms of all of these 5 different divine institutions where these become modalities of attack in our culture. And again, they are work, they're marriage, the whole issue of family, right? All of these things are under attack by Satan. And we can't forget this. And the other place where there is attack, and we know this without a doubt, and that's human government or civil government. And then today, the final one that we talk about this morning is this whole issue of nations. So we need to remember that we are in a battle, so to speak, not with flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of this world. We need to remember this, that these are a battleground. And so we see here when we think about this, and when we launch into this whole idea of the battleground for the nations, we come down to this whole idea whenever God structured this world, he gave fundamental guidance to mankind. And so one of those, we're going to see 2 major areas when we land in Genesis chapter 11, where there's a deviation from God's plan and design. Now there's many more, but I'm just picking out 2. I had to reconstruct my whole sermon yesterday because I had too much material. All right? So I had to recraft everything, just kind of boil it down a little bit. All right? If the truth is known, when we get to Genesis chapter 11, we could probably spend at least 3 to 4 weeks if you really want to unearth everything that's in this chapter, or in this first 9 verses, all right? Because it has so much information, but we're just going to boil it down to 1 week. But nevertheless, God commanded Adam and Eve and their posterity to multiply, all right? To multiply, but they were to fill the earth. That was God's command to Adam and Eve. And we see here in Genesis 1:28 where God gave this command, and he said, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And so this was not just for the purpose of multiplication, but that man would go out into all of the earth and subdue it. Now, when we talk about this whole idea of subdue it, the Hebrew word there is a little bit more than what we would think of in that, like we think of subdue as kind of like harness it. But it's really much more deeper than that. It's exercise dominion over all of creation. And so God commanded that man was to bring everything, right? Everything in earth under the control for their advantage. So that's what God expected man to do, to use everything that he's created, right? To what? To your advantage, to use it, to allow the world to flourish. That's the whole idea. And so this was also stated to Noah. So it was stated to Noah as well as to Adam and Eve, right? That they were to what? Go forth and multiply. We see this in Genesis 9, where he gives the instructions to Noah right after he comes out of the ark. He says, and as for you, be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. That's in Genesis chapter 9, verse 7. And so we see here what happens when we land in Genesis chapter 11, right? How our men reject God's command to fill the earth and settle in the land of Shinar. Okay, so notice what it says in verses 1 and 2. It says, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words, and it came about as they journeyed east that they found the plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. All right, so we see here what's happening. So the whole idea here is that man disobeys God's ordinance to do what? Go out into all the earth, move out from where the ark landed, right? And Adam was to go what? Out. That's the whole idea. And what? Allow the earth to what? And subdue it. And so this is what happens though, all right? So I want to just make one small notation here. When we get to Genesis chapter 10, we see this genealogy that takes place, right? And one of the things I want to make mention of, and this is kind of like a little bit of a quandary where some people will say, the Bible is kind of like mixed up and it doesn't have truths. And so the whole issue here in Genesis chapter 10 is the generations that happen after Noah comes out of the ark. All right, where he has his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? And what their lineage is all about, right? One of the things we need to remember is what happens in chapter 10 talks about the languages, right? So notice so chapter 10 tells us what happened in terms of people going out throughout all the earth. But chapter 11, verses 1 through 9, tell us what happened before chapter 10 came to fruition. Does that make sense? So God acted because he wanted men to go out. Now notice what it says here in chapter 10. It says here, before we get into 11, he makes mention here that each one of these people groups are divided and they go according to their different languages. Now notice what it says in verse 5, chapter 10, verse 5. And it says, from these coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his what? Language. You see that? Okay. And then hop down to chapter 10, verse 20, where it says, these are the sons of Ham according to their families, according to their what? Language, by their lands and by their nations. And then we go on down to chapter 10, verse 31, and it says again, 31 says, these are the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, you see this? By their lands according to their nations. And we see it again in 32. And these are the families of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies by the nations. And out of these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood. You see, what happens is chapter 10 tells us how they dispersed, right, and where they went. But chapter 11 precedes what is recorded in chapter 10 because God acts to what? Change people to have different languages. And whenever those different languages take place, that's whenever everyone begins to scatter. Okay, so we're all on the same page here. So actually, chapter 11, verses 1 through 9 take place and are the background information for what takes place in chapter 10. So just so we have that understanding, but before the scattering that talks about in chapter 10 takes place, man, or most all of people, came out of the ark and they all settled together in a group. And whenever they settled together in a group, right, are they following God's command to what? Disperse and multiply and go out to the outermost parts of the earth? No, they're not. They're staying together. And so we see here what they're doing is the whole earth used the same language. We see this in chapter 1, or chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. The whole earth used the same language and the same words, and it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And so a majority of people post-flood moved east and settled in this plain of Shinar. This is in modern-day Iraq, all right? And so what happens is the primary leader of this group is Nimrod. And Nimrod is the son of Cush. And we see where he is here in chapter 10. We see this, repeated here in chapter 10 about who Nimrod is. Nimrod, as we see here, is mentioned here in verse 8, right? And it says, and now Cush became the father of Nimrod, and he became the mighty one of the earth, and he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And so the beginning of his kingdom, you see what's happening here? Now, when it talks about him being a mighty hunter, this is not like a hunter of game. This is a hunter of people, okay? And he began to have dominion and tyranny and rule with an iron thumb with these people groups. Now notice what it says. It continues here. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and the Akkad and Calneh and the land of Shinar. And from the land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth. You ever been to Rehoboth? This is not the same one. This is Rehoboth-ir and Calah and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is a great city, and Mizraim, and became the father. So now we're talking, when we get to verse 13, it's talking about another person. But nevertheless, what we see here happening is that Nimrod is building a kingdom. This is not a good kingdom, folks. This is a nefarious place. But nevertheless, what's happening here is that they're all settling in this region and are becoming under the dominion of one person called Nimrod. Nimrod was the leader of this kingdom and had several cities to make that kingdom. And we see this documented in chapter 10, verses 10 through 12. You see? That's what he is doing. So man rejected the concept of what? Going out and filling the earth and multiplying. They came to one location and settled there, all the families of Noah. And so now we see the second area where there is conflict. And there's a problem with what is happening post-flood. God gave people dominion, but what does God do? God gave them what? A command to go out and multiply. They don't do that. And now he's given them dominion, and what do they do with this dominion? So now we see here, when God established marriage between one man and one woman, right? He gave them specific instructions that apply not only to them, but future generations. In verse 26 of Genesis chapter 1, it says, Then God said, Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle and over all the earth. See this? All the earth. See, it's going out. over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. You see, man was appointed to be a steward of the earth, and he was an exercised dominion over God's entire creation. And so man was responsible to govern every aspect of the earth in behalf of God. And God wants man to flourish and enjoy his what? Creation. Even though it's in a fallen state, he wants us to have dominion over it and to rule over it. So this is restated to Noah in the post-flood in chapter 9, verses 2 and 3, where it says the fear of you, that is man, and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth, and on every bird of the sky, and everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are given. Every moving thing is alive shall be available to you for food, and I give it to you all, as I gave the green plants. So God changed the rules by what man could eat, right? But the idea, aren't you glad that you can go have what? Steak this afternoon? Does that sound good? Steak? That sounds good. But you see, that's what God did. He gave man what? The dominion to have authority over his creation. And they were to go out and have that dominion. But what happens here in the land of Shinar over the dominion of Nimrod? You see, what happens is instead of man having dominion over creation, men were focused on having dominion over what? People, as opposed to creation. And so they said to one another, notice what they say here in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 11. And the goal and the objective of Nimrod. And evidently he has this group of people that have this fixation. They said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. They said, come, let us build for ourselves. Notice what it says, let us build for ourselves. You see that? Build for ourselves a city, a tower, whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. See what the whole focus is there? It's focusing on what? Themselves. Are they focused in on God's glory? Not in the least. Make a name for ourselves, otherwise we'll be scattered abroad. You see, there's this idea, what? That being scattered abroad, what makes you vulnerable abroad over the face of the whole earth. You see, their focus was completely on themselves. It was not to honor God or to do what he told them to do. It was exactly the opposite. So through the leadership of Nimrod, men began to dwell in cities, that is, fortifications, and focused on building this tower. And their focus was to build a worship center that would reach into the heavens. Now, that we see it here, it's called the Tower of Babel. But we see here where this tower was more than likely what we would call today a ziggurat. How many of you ever heard of a ziggurat? Okay. And so this is from Dr. Randall Price, just to kind of give you an idea about these ziggurats. Ziggurats consisted of states of towers stacked upon one another, decreasing in size as they progress upward, similar to the form of step pyramid in Egypt. I don't want to go through the pronunciation of that, Egyptian pyramid. But nevertheless, the ziggurat was dedicated to the city's Persian deity and topped by the figure of a god or goddess. You see, this was a worship center. Okay? The temple of the ziggurat had both a cultic function and a cosmic function, linking heaven and earth to the netherworld. And texts also associate the sanctuary, which is at the top of the ziggurat. The sanctuary at the top of the ziggurat was depicted a cosmic mountain, which typically supported the structure of the ziggurat, was the access point of the gods to travel between heaven and earth. Now, just to give you a little bit of background here beyond what Dr. Price is talking about here is, remember the text says that they also made it with what? Pitch. So this became a waterproof, it's like a tar, it becomes waterproof. So what do you think man was afraid of in terms of what had just happened a few generations previous? They were afraid of another flood, you see? And if they build a ziggurat that goes up in a tower and they line it with pitch, what are they trying to do? Preserve themselves from what? God's judgment and his wrath. See, that's what they're trying to do. And they're trying to reach heaven, right? Not the God, the God of the universe, but they're trying to make what? Their own God. Randall Price goes on to say, the biblical text states that the purpose of the Babel structure was to prevent people from being scattered abroad. In contrast with Genesis 1:28, which we talked about earlier. In other words, the verse described an urbanization project to keep the population together around a single administrative complex with a temple at its center. This urbanization process contributed to the deification of human rulers who maintain control over the temple state. You see this? People in authority wanted to be what? Worshipped. The problem in Genesis 11, 1 through 6 is not construction of a city, but the purpose of the city, its cultic center that deified humans and thus degrade the nature of God. You see, whenever you worship what? A human being, are you any longer worshiping the holy God? No. And once this concept took hold, mankind would alter their entire relationship with the Creator. You see, what they were trying to do is extinguish the creator-creature concept. They wanted not to be held accountable to what? The eternal holy God. They wanted to erect what? Their own gods. Through reflective the words, and we see this in Genesis 11:6. You see, what they were doing is they were erecting this system. Now, what's believed, and they have strong evidence of this, is that inside of the top of these temples that were at the top of these ziggurats, on the ceilings were these depictions of stars and so forth. And so this became a worship center. It is if one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. The wording is similar to that in Genesis 3:22, that man has now become like one of us. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and live forever. Now, what's interesting is that Karen and I, we were on a cruise some years back. It was a while ago. And we went down to South America, or Central America, in Mexico. I think it was in the Yucatan Peninsula, where we saw these temples, these kind of like ziggurat type features. And this is the depiction of what they see as the one in Iraq, right? They're all over the world. These temples. And so you see this practice taking place not only here, but after God, changed the languages of everybody, they took these cultic practices all over the world. And so this temple here is also a place of what? Human sacrifice at the top of these. And so that's what's taking place. So you see God's solution for man's defiance. Okay? So God says, wait a minute, we got a problem here, and we're gonna deal with this problem. And so now we see here where we pick up here again in verses 3 and 4, and it says, and then they came so they came, come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into the heavens, and let us, notice all the personal pronouns there, let us make ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. And so now we see here where in verse 5, there's a tempo shift, right? See, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. So God's got a solution here for this dilemma or this problem that man has created. And so the account of Babel is a record of man's rebellion. It's man's defiance to what God has instituted and told them to do. And they're saying, nuh-uh, we're doing it our own way. So all men and all women have the natural defiance towards God and his commands, a heart that we are all deep down rebels. And so man's defiance and his rebellion is consistent, right? We have the fall, we have the first murder, we have the flood, and now we have the Babel, are all proof of man's defiance and his rebellion. So in each instance, God desires to save men from their rebellion and their defiance, and God must eradicate evil to salvage mankind. And that's what he does. He acts to what? Make sure that his plan will be an option. So Babel is another instance where God supernaturally acts to deal with sin and rebellion. So now here we see, and everyone spoke the same language, which facilitated this man's ability to perpetrate wickedness and evil. Notice what it says in verse 6. It says, and the Lord God said, behold, they are one people, and they have the same language. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. You see, man's defiance is real. And so Nimrod became the central leader who built an empire with cities, all who focused their energy on a central location of worship. More than likely, the person that they were worshiping was Nimrod, but nevertheless, it's a city and it's a Tower of Babel. You see, they're able to erect and accomplish these remarkable things because they all spoke one language. And I might add, is that one of the things that we see here is that, folks, these people are not eating bananas and climbing trees and getting pineapples. Now, these people were incredibly brilliant. And so what we see here is that when we see how these things are erected and what's inside of these constructed facilities, these people were remarkable engineers. So they also spoke the same language, but no longer do they worship the holy God, but they now worshiped a pagan god, more than likely Nimrod, and they sought to make a name for themselves. They did not want to honor God, and so God resolved the problem by confusing their language. Thus, man was unable to plot evil, and God's desire to scatter humanity happening by instituting the fifth divine institution at his people groups. Now, notice what it says here in verses 7 and 8. It says here in 7 and 8, it says, come. Notice here, it's this idea of the Trinity is almost, it says, come, let us go down there and confuse their language. This is a divine act of judgment. Let us confuse their language so that they will not understand one another's speech. And so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. And so God created this whole idea of what? The variance in human languages. I forget the exact number of human languages that's out there, but it's remarkable, the number. And so this is the reason why man has such a difficult time. With respect to, historically, they've had a difficult time. But now what's happening? We have all kind of devices and all kind of tools to do what? Do you know what the number one language tool is called that you can buy? It's called Babel. You see, what's happening here is that what is happening as we see technology advance and things take place, we're all kind of coming together so that we can begin to speak one language. And the greater that comes down to speaking one language and having one globalist mindset, what happens? Depravity and wickedness, increase. You see that happening in our world today? You see, the fifth divine institution was designed by God to what? Put a brakes and a tamper on what? Man's rampant desire for wickedness, rebellion, and evil against him. God was tapping the brakes for humanity. And so we see here, Satan, what he seeks to do is attack on nations. These are just some of the things that I came up with. It is a centralized power and authority. Did that happen in Babel? Centralized power and authority? Absolutely. Eliminate personal liberties, right? Whenever all your resources are going to build the temple and the cities, guess what? People don't have any personal liberties or even personal wealth. It's a redistribution of wealth. It's for the common good. Force a private and public mission. Unify all religions. All religions are coming under one banner. You see, the push for man to what? Worship under one. So the push today is to what? Have everybody worship together. There's no, what we're often told is there's no real difference. They all have the same idea, right? That is a lie from the pit of hell. And so these are some of Satan's objectives. So now what do we see here? What Satan seeks to do is he seeks to commandeer the nations. Satan seeks to distort the definition of nations or a people group. Each people group, that is nations, shares a common language and has the potential to unite under a common form of human government. That's a good thing, right? But what happens is that Satan seeks to distort that. Satan seeks to deceive people and entice them to believe that a global government is the solution for humanity. You see, we're often told that even today. It's horribly destructive and contrary to God's divine institution. Both the Old Testament and New Testament prophecies tell us that there will be a one world centralized government. Okay? We talked about that this morning in Sunday school. Satan will be the driving force for the false trinity, that is the Antichrist, the false prophet, and the beast. Satan seeks to deceive us. Another one is that on one side of the coin, right, Satan seeks to divide people within each nation. But oddly enough, Satan also seeks to unite people under one global governance, just like Babel. Even today, we see that where nations are in turmoil internally, there's political division, there's racial division, there's economic division, and all are driving forces for internal division. And yet, on the other side of the coin, we are primed by a globalist, one world government. And it's closer than you think. Some of the big organizations that are pushing a globalist government today are the United Nations, the World Economic Forum. You want to get an education? Go to the WEF website, World Economic Forum. You'll see their desires for a one world government. The WHO, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and finally, and not least, the World Bank. All of these are seeking to establish a one world globalist government. See, Satan is alive and he's well. You see, Satan seeks to destroy, and this is really important, the advancement of the gospel to the nations. The Great Commission, and this is where we come in, folks. The Great Commission given by Jesus is the last command that he gave to his disciples, and that is that the church has a duty to spread the gospel to what? All peoples, to all languages, and to all nations. And even though that there's this push by evil people and Satan, I would say, to have a one world globalist government, what God seeks to do is what? Unite everyone under what? Him. But we see where others have nefarious desires otherwise. So what are some application points for us this morning? First off, the first divine institution is nations, or the fifth divine institution is nations. Satan will deploy every asset to destroy nations to form a global government. Second, believers must be keenly aware of Satan's tactics to divide and disempower the church regarding moral issues and political involvement. Look, folks, if there's anyone who's involved and engaged politically, it should be believers. We should be voices for on moral issues. And we should also be involved with the political process. We need to be bold and courageous, standing up for what is biblical. Third, believers should be the most enthusiastic, and I think this is really important. Believers should be the most enthusiastic and positive people in our nation, and I would say in the world. Look, we need to realize that God is in control and his plan will unfold, and we need to be celebrating that reality. Look, we have hope that we need to give to other people. And we should be the ones who are what? Most positive of anybody, right? Fourth, all believers are messengers of hope to our unbelieving friends. And we are to build redemptive bridges. This is really important. Jesus still saves sinners. Aren't you glad? But we are his messengers in this what? Wicked world that seeks to do exactly the opposite of what God wants and desires. We're called to do what? Take the good news of Jesus, right? To these people who desperately need him. What a privilege. What a calling. And then finally, the Great Commission is still in effect. Missions work should be a high priority for individual believers and churches to take the gospel to all nations, to all languages, and to all people. You see, men, they're going to do what they want to do, right? But we have a higher calling, and that is to take the good news to a fallen world.